your big project, was Americatown.
How much did you catch of that book?
I read all of it.
That's terrifying to me right now.
Hello, welcome to a new episode of Borderless, which I found out it's a very unfortunate name because it's also the name of a Lawrence Southern documentary.
Oh no.
Oh yeah, and it's thematically appropriate because it's about immigration, the documentary, and the podcast is about discussions with artists working in comics outside their national industries, which is something I don't know if I'm cheating with you, Daniel Irizarri.
Hey, Alan.
Because you're from Puerto Rico.
It's right on the margin. It's right on the border.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you, because I think it's at that fuzzy line between when do you start to attack this concept of working outside of your country, because Puerto Rico is a territory of the U.S., but it's not a U.S. state, as I understand it.
Yeah, it functions as a territory for many things, for many inconveniences for the U.S., but it is something else when it is inconvenient for the U.S. For example, when it comes to payment, getting any kind of payment for my work, there's usually like one or two extra hurdles. There is like one or two things that get treated sort of like an international job. And I apologize, at some point you might hear my cat meowing.
Yeah.
There's usually an additional headache that I have to talk with whoever's in charge of these things to explain that we technically do count as the United States. And it's also something that I was talking to someone about it recently, that it's like politically I kind of agree that we are not the United States, but when it comes to online stuff, online shopping, it's just really inconvenient.
When I really got the idea of inviting you here, it was on an episode on your podcast, Max Flantalo, or Max Flantayo.
You can pronounce it Max Flantayo, yeah.
After the US election, when you said that you couldn't vote in the election since you're on the island. If you were in the US, you could have voted.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's when it clicked, because it's an experience I don't know if everyone, but a lot of people, even from outside the US, were looking at the US election. It usually is one of the most important things that happens in the world, and it affects everybody. And
yes.
It's frustrating that you cannot participate in.
Yes, but we have like citizenship. Puerto Ricans do have a US citizenship, but it only applies to when we are on what they call the mainland. I don't like that because, well, to me the mainland is my island. The right to vote is key because the president does a lot of the let's say foreign policy, the things that end up affecting the island directly, as I'm sure the rest of the world gets affected by the American elections. So I completely understand the sentiment. It's just even more frustrating because we have this bait of citizenship. We have the citizenship card is something that gets dangled over our head politically, not by the Americans, but by our own pro-statehood party on the island. They act as if this citizenship is the ultimate privilege that we are being ingrateful for by scoffing at or criticizing the United States in any way.
Mm-hmm. Getting a bit away from politics. Did you grow up in Puerto Rico, or?
I had a mixed, I was raised 4 years in the U.S. You could probably tell that my accent is very American. Or it was at some point. I feel like it has loosened up into something a little bit more Puerto Rican or a little bit more less caring. But it was formative years. It was from first grade to fourth grade, which I feel like are years that one absorbs so much information. One is basically a sponge for world perspective. And then after 4th grade, beginning of 5th grade, I was snapped back to Puerto Rico, not like against my will, but you know, you're a 9-year-old. You're not making any kind of life decisions. So my father decided that it was time to go back, and we went back, and that kind of made me I was an outsider over there, and by the time I came back, I was an outsider over here.
No, that's sad. And when did you get into comics? Like when you were in the mainland, or is there a difference in the comics culture between the two places, or at least where you lived in the US, because it's large?
Yeah, I lived in small town middle America, South Dakota. And South Dakota is one of the least populated states in all of the US. It's sort of like center north, but everything after Chicago is called the West. So it's Midwest. In South Dakota, there wasn't much culture, period. So comic book reading culture, or like where I was in South Dakota, small town, there wasn't that much of a comic book reading culture. But, you know, you had TV, you had like, my family was lucky enough to have like Dish Network or like DirecTV. It was one of them. Obviously, I was consuming superhero cartoons and that stuff. And my brother, I'm the youngest of 4.5 siblings. And my oldest brother was very much into this 90s wave of comic books. So his room was the whole basement, or the basement was like the coolest place. It had all of his comics, like Image, Marvel, Onslaught stuff. And during those 90s years, I was already reading and consuming all of that.
Mm-hmm.
The other half of your question was, I guess, comics culture on the island. And there was like independent comic creators who had been like making strips. It was usually like newspaper strips that would eventually get collected into comic books. But perhaps I'm like the least informed to describe it, because like I was a child during that time. But it felt like comics culture in the 90s was very homogenous in Puerto Rico and the States. I say that because I recently inherited a big suitcase of comics from my brother-in-law, my sister's husband. He's a great guy, but he was also reading comics during that 90s era, and the suitcase is just full of Image books, Marvel books, Onslaught, all of that stuff.
Were there lots of shops on Puerto Rico, or you were importing them?
Yeah, there was plenty of comic book shops. This is, again, I guess, part of the globalization, homogenization process, where we had like this nice golden period of malls and shops. And for the longest time, the mall in the town where we lived had a really nice comic book shop. I forgot the name of it, but it was almost like a very romantic. It was like Heroes Still Among Us or something like that. That was where I got like my first taste. Like when I finally had the chance to start buying comic books, that's where I went. And like a year later, it shut down. I feel like that's when different stores, different things began closing. It started with the comic shops, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think it's strange how comic books are sort of a canary in the mine of
mm-hmm.
industry. Like for good and bad, like there are business practices that have been foundational for comic books that are just entering into the broader creative industries, the work for hire stuff.
Yes. I was even just going to say narratively, like yes, there's business stuff, but narratively, it feels like I don't even want to praise them in any way, but Disney realizing the actual narrative potential of long form comics storytelling is interesting to witness. I'm watching WandaVision, and a lot of people have hot takes on if it's good or bad. It has to be bad because it's Disney, or it's good because it's Marvel, and people are very like obsessed. I'm just appreciating it from a distance, that a story like that could not be told with superheroes in anything but comics up until now.
Yeah, and not only long form, but the way it's all interconnected, and it references various storylines over the years,
And it spans genres too.
Yeah. So, did you keep up with comics over the years? Because I found that a lot of people have this waning interest when they're teenagers, and they're sort of rediscovering them during college. Did something like this happen to you, or?
It is something like that. I think I always had the interest, but there was a period in time in which I had no access to them. This was during middle school, when I was already back in Puerto Rico. Middle school, early high school. My only access to these things was whatever was in like a supermarket rack. And that meant like Wizard Magazine. We've talked about Wizard Magazine a couple times in Mex Plantayo. And it's because, at least for me and maybe for Ramon too, it was our... the only thing that would satisfy the comic book itch while comic books were outside of our grasp. From there, early high school, I started seeing those Shonen Jump publications, and they were what I consumed most. So like, I wasn't reading American comics, but I was reading Japanese comics throughout those high school years. I was obviously watching like anime on Toonami, and then around high school and college was when I finally had more access, because where I moved to had a Borders, like where I studied college had a Borders. But it became sort of like a place where I could finally make up for the comics I hadn't read in the past. And I got to a point where I started keeping up with comics contemporaneously. And it coincided with college. That's where the majority of my comic book collection, or my trade collection, accumulated. And yes, there is sort of like, I've noticed the same trend with other guests we've talked to on the podcast, and everyone has sort of like a golden period in which they consume the most of their comic books. And people my age, or Ramon and me, it is sort of like around that 2005, 2006, maybe 2004 for some people, and usually there is some point in which we reach sort of like saturation, or the work, if we get lucky enough to start getting comic book work, the work starts to become so much that we start to fall behind on reading, and we have to like make this choice to let it go.
Mm-hmm. And that's when you started thinking about pursuing a career in comics, or was that somehow always a sort of ambition, or
Yes, I don't know. I've been called one-track minded by many people, but it's because I've always known that this is what I wanted to do. I think only recently have I begun to contemplate other careers after having experienced comic books. But all throughout my life, I was drawing comic books. I have notebooks upon notebooks of since middle school, since before that, but the notebooks I have are around since middle school of stories, like original stories that I wrote. They were like fantasy sort of metaphors, like main characters named Daniel who have like magical abilities, stuff like that. But I was always drawing comic books. I feel very comfortable. It's sort of like my natural state is to write and draw comic book.
By this point, there's been a few episodes of Max Fentayo, but in the episode where we talked about breaking into comics, which I was very anxious about, because I started listening to that and I started to think that it will render this discussion unnecessary. But Ramon did most of the talking, and you also.
He has most of the experience. I'm a little bit more low key. I do have like a career timeline, and I think we'll eventually get to like the bigger stuff like during Flintayo. But he has a lot of anecdotes and stories about his breaking in that are very interesting to listen to.
And in that episode, you mentioned these contests that happened on websites, on comics websites, like Comics Should Be Good or Multiversity Comics. I don't think that you mentioned that, but I've found you.
Yeah. There was that. There was project design, superhero redesign contest stuff was very important in my mind during those early 2010s. Tumblr became a place where there was legitimate networking happening. I was posting regularly, and I guess to bring it back to the Mex Flintayo, sort of like us talking about our first projects, like Ramon had a very different Tumblr career experience. He very much played the game and did it very well, of what people wanted to see, what was most likely to get on the radar of other people in that world. I was too snobby. I was much snobbier. I was much more pretentious about it, and I insisted on drawing sort of like whatever people really wanted to see. I would just draw the opposite. And and I guess my career is explainable that way, probably, like why less people know about my work. I had that phase in the early 2010s where I was drawing crossovers, and I could tell that people wanted a specific kind of thing, and more I would want to do the opposite of that thing, and it created a sort of a superhero burnout. Whenever I was drawing Superman, people were reacting to Superman. People were reacting to Batman, the X-Men, etc. And I had no idea or no way of knowing if they were reacting to my work at all.
Or to the brand.
Yeah, it was the brand, and I can make a nice drawing of that character, but the brand was what people cared about. And at around 2012 or something, let's say it coincided a little bit with my like wanting to have a little bit more of an artistic expression. I guess I started fracturing a little bit. And if we're talking about like online personalities, there was like the comic book, the superhero comics type stuff, and I wanted to go full on into sort of like Mobius creative freedom.
So, did you gravitate towards those websites like a conscious career move, or was it simply an extension of, I don't know, reading Wizard magazine and participating in the culture?
It was a bit of both. I spent a lot of time on Deviant Art. Yeah, there's a lot of like guides or like how to make it into comics, where there was a lot of content like that during that time, maybe earlier. Wizard magazine had like tastes of that, but it was all very like fictionalized or romanticized. But during that time, early on in DeviantArt, like 2007, 2008, maybe earlier, was the first time that I could see and follow comic book artists directly. And they had, comments. They would reply to comments if you were blessed by a reply or something like that. But also, for the longest time, I was exploring the world of sequential art through sort of like a manga lens. So I was reading a lot of manga, and my brother, who I inherited this sort of like comics world from, he's an artist as well, and he would follow these things, and there was Tokyo Pop had a contest about rising talent manga or something like that, and he knew that I really, really liked drawing. He knew that I had comics that had potential, and so even though I was like 15 at the time, he presented to me this contest and this possibility of how I had to structure my pitch. So even though I was completely not ready for that world at all, I did always have the goal. I did always have like different avenues that I was trying to very ignorantly explore as to how to make it into the industry. And I think just seeing artists process on DeviantArt, seeing a little bit of how the thing gets made, seeing how they are connected, because what you would notice that in DeviantArt, you would see, let's say I'm following 6, 7, 8 important artists, maybe 4 of them would be intercommenting. They would be contemporaries who would have a community amongst themselves. And obviously you would see that, and you would see the in-jokes, and you would say, wow, I really want to be part of that. They're so cool. And at the same time, I was finding contemporaries of my own, people who were my age, who were around my skill level, maybe better, maybe a little worse, and we would encourage each other. And I didn't know it back then, but I was doing the same thing as the grown-ups were in our own little junior space.
Do you think that opportunity is there right now? Like how things moved on? Because Comics Should Be Good is gone, Comics Alliance is gone, and
I think the environment that encourages this kind of, I don't want to say closedness, like as in closed environment in a negative way, but it's sort of like these incubation pods are missed. I don't know where they're happening right now. I think if we're to use like Twitter as an example, there's no pod. Like, there is no closed environment where something can be cultivated before being exposed to the general world. Twitter is a super highway, and maybe drawing bad or learning to draw, like maybe there's still people in DeviantArt or stuff like that, but the curation and cultivation of content is something that might be missing. I don't know if comics are better or worse off, but I do remember that time fondly.
You've said that the first published work, it was that short and Prophet 42, Greetings from Verde Luz.
Yes.
A short heist comedy horror sci-fi story.
Did you read it?
Yeah. That came out from this kind of environment, like
it came out literally DeviantArt. I followed Brandon Graham for a good while on DeviantArt. Like, it was one of these things where he had followed me back, and I didn't want to take that too seriously. I was already starting to experiment with a little bit more sci-fi art, so this was like later in my DeviantArt life. This was actually like my second account. I had a first account that was much more immature. I don't even want to say the name because it's just too it's too immature. Not really understanding the process of how one gets into comics, I just wrote to him at one point being like, listen, I really love what you're doing in Prophet. You're making real sci-fi. This is when I was like starting to get into Mobius, starting to get into a lot more creative art for art's sake type comic books. And I saw that he was employing different artists who were around my age, around my, like, I obviously understand now that Simon Roy is incredibly, like, much more talented than I consider myself, or Janice, Milo Janice, incredibly much more talented as well. But I was like, if these guys are in there, like, who knows? Maybe I could get in there too. And like, he probably understood that as well, but he was willing to give me a chance with a little backup short story, which Prophet kind of became known for, having these spotlights of interesting sci-fi creations in the back 5 pages.
Mm-hmm. And then kind of evolved into The Island.
Yeah, that eventually became Island, and I felt a way that I was not, me living on an island was not invited to any kind of Island comics creation. Like, for whatever reason, I was never close to Brandon Graham, and maybe a little bit thankful for that these days, I will say.
Yeah, I was going to ask about this. Like how distance between creators facilitates this kind of a double persona, like having the online persona and having no access to something like the shitty things he was doing, and that were circulating more through interpersonal networks, whisper networks and stuff. And especially when, and I remember at the time that everyone was praising Brandon Graham.
Yes,
and
he could do no wrong for an amount of time.
And a lot of his clout was built on progressive issues. Like I remember him beefing a lot with Brian Wood, another character. And a lot of his threads on Twitter were about how Brian Wood was a fake feminist and so on. And
yes,
I don't really know what to say other than to remark on the problems that this sort of distance from physical distance from creators can create.
I think that quarantine has been sort of a leveling of the playing field in that way, where everyone is distanced. Everyone is forced to maybe only interact in that online artist persona. And I don't know how things will unfold, if there's ever any kind of reopening, if there's any kind of a going back to the convention model, like the Comic Cons, the indie comics festivals, because I feel like that's where the ego, the problematic behaviors might manifest more. I don't know how to describe it, and I don't want to describe it like positively or negatively, because there are like positives, like seeing friends, spending time with friends is good, but I have no idea how one mitigates these other very, very important negatives. I think having the conversation online helps. But other than taking a public stand and like, it's so easy to prop yourself up as a hero performatively, as a hero, as a feminist and all of that. And we don't know who is behind those statements. Like a very like recent example, or for the past couple of years, has been like the Joss Whedon discourse. It's similar in a way, like this sort of like overcompensation of feminism, to not veer off too far into a tangent. Brandon Graham, for all of his faults, did give me that chance to draw comic books, and he lived and did some shitty things in his career, and I don't personally know what he can do. Like, I guess that's sort of like my general ponderances on if someone is canceled or not. And I'm using this sort of like sarcastically. I don't necessarily think that it's sort of that real. I like, for example, Brandon Graham still has comics coming out. People still read them. He still has plenty of followers on Instagram and Facebook. But I don't know what he can do that would allow him to return to the world of the living on Twitter and not have this particular situation be brought up every single time his name is mentioned.
Yeah, but that wasn't really your first published comic, right?
There was some local publications. There was a comic book I worked on for a company called Razorblade Apple. I had also been self-publishing for a long time before that.
Going through Comixology, I found you had a part in a superhero comic called The Cycle.
Ah, yes. There's also The Cycle with Jacob Free, fun writer, great guy, that I know, of course. This is talking internet distance, but he's always been very interesting to talk to. His scripts were always punchy. And I think this might have been after the Prophet book.
That was published in 2012. Prophet was in 2014, I think.
Yes.
I don't know how it was on your end when you send the files and so on, and when you produce the comic.
This City, This Fire, The Cycle was a series that it's sort of like Jacob's long-running project with different artists. So The Cycle itself might have started before I drew it, like, and the This City, This Fire, the portion that I drew was around mid to late 2013. I have a pretty good recollection of working that book after I graduated in 2013, whereas the pages for Prophet that I drew were at the end of 2012. It eventually got published, I think, beginnings of 2013. That Prophet number 32.
How did you get started on The Cycle?
Tumblr. The creators that kind of gravitated around me were a little bit more interested in that sort of esoteric type work. And with Jacob, even though he was doing a superhero comic book, he was doing something much more on the strange side, on the surreal side, meta analysis of comic. The artists that he was working with weren't exactly just superhero guys.
Yeah, it's very much in that post Alan Moore, post Morrison.
Yes.
I was reminded a lot of that Letham Omega and the Unknown reboot. Do you know of it?
Do you mean the Feral
Dal Rimpe one? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know the art. I didn't read the story, but that art was very impressive.
The first artist that drew the Cycle reminded me a lot of that one, and the story itself is kind of in the same vein, very much real world, completely real world, not Watchmen real world, with a superhero and branding and stuff and addiction. Do you know why each chapter was drawn by a different artist, or
like it might have been budgetary constraints? It's hard to like hold on to an artist for too long when it comes to indie work, when it comes to like pitches and stuff like that. I feel like a lot of my comic book work from this period is pitches. And some pitches that people still haven't seen to this day. I haven't posted too much about them. Stuff that I really liked. Some with our writers I'm working with right now. But I think it has to do with dynamics between writers and artists. And writers will always be able to maybe have access to younger, less polished artists as they're coming up. And if that artist is good enough, they will probably get maybe a following of their own. They'll get picked up by other companies. And maybe that writer will go into those companies well, like they will develop a career. But I don't know the specific motivations for for Jacob Free's choices in artists, but I feel like he made it work thematically, where each issue kind of focused on a different aspect of that world that the artist was more tailored for.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to give him no credit either. I think that writers have to work with what they have. And as an artist, I also have my desire to like spread out and grow and do my own comics. So it's no fault of writers in that sense.
Mm. And even though you wanted to spread your wings creatively into more imaginative areas, I think that your next big project, or I mean, your big project, was Americatown.
Finally, a podcast where we can talk about that. I'm only laughing because it was a very strange experience. How much did you catch of that book?
I read all of it.
That's terrifying to me right now. I would love to hear your opinion on the subject, and maybe I can fill in some of the blanks or like talk a little bit about what happened behind the scenes.
So to recap it a bit, it's placed in a world where basically the relationship between North America and South America, specifically the US and Argentina, have been reversed, and so people in America are migrating illegally into Buenos Aires and setting up small American communities there. And
yes,
it's very strange that it's been in 2015, because the mayor of the city is basically Trump.
mm-hmm.
This orange bombastic guy with very blonde hair, going on a very anti-immigrant campaign.
Yes, I agree that there are a lot of things that are very prescient to sort of where things went, but when you do this kind of flip on the narrative, it's like walking on a lot of eggshells.
Yeah, it's very strange. It's like this 1970s sci-fi where you literally
yes.
have reverse the relationships,
Yes.
and show
It's
white bodies in this subjugating
at the expense of then showing people of color as the villains. Like, it is a reversal that's meant to be like, what if the shoe was on the other foot? But then that other foot is people of color. And I always felt like that part inevitably would stoke fear of people of color. Like this constant idea of the only reason they are not oppressing us is because they don't have the power to oppress us. If race relations were flipped, then it would be the people of color who would be enslaving the white man. And I don't know how one fixes the situation. Maybe Star Trek fixes it by having the people of color be an alien race, for example. But the antagonists, or the people who the book put the protagonist against, I'm actually like blanking on the name of the protagonist, were vile or mean Argentinians or Latino people. Not all of them were specified as Argentinian, and Argentina definitely has a big white population, like people who live as white people, as I do in Puerto Rico, which is again a tricky dichotomy to put on the page. And I always felt that the writer didn't necessarily have the tact to convey it. Like as I got the script, this really was my big break. Apparently some people had turned down the book, and I was just desperate enough to be like, what? Boom Studios, a studio that I've heard about, wants me to try to work on a comic book, and they're paying me I tried to get it like to like $100 a page, but they were like, no, like most we can do is 75. But 75 for a book which is 22 pages starts to become money that I can better my life with a little bit, you know? So I suffered through the narrative missteps. And again, this is me talking from the perspective of somebody who wants to write comics, or somebody who like me, somebody who thinks that they're a writer as well. So I had to bite my tongue with narrative choices, with dialogue choices, and things that I knew would read very differently from a Latino perspective. And I had absolutely no power. And this is the hired freelance aspect of that job, that like I was not being paid to have any creative input in this book.
Mm-hmm. I remember a tweet that was making the rounds a few years ago. It was this lady that was saying that companies are hiring international artists for their experiences, and this sounded very wrong to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, obviously they're hiring international people because they're cheap, and precisely because
Mm-hmm.
artists usually don't have that much of an input into the story.
Yeah, where are the international writers? There's not many.
And usually they're from Canada or the UK.
It is very much though I guess the word would be like sort of a mask. We're like, there is a convenience to having some international artist that is giving the world around it, because I don't know if this came across while you were reading it, but I tried to fill the page with what I felt were real people and real reactions to the events of the book. So while I was restrained to only draw the narrative in terms of what was being spoken, I tried to insert the real rest of the world around it. And I can do that more successfully maybe now or in more recent projects. But you're right that it is a bit of a facade, a cork, or to stop a sort of a broader complaint. It's like hiring a female artist for a book written by a man. I don't know if the proper term would be a woman artist or a femme artist. The female artist is definitely getting an opportunity, but the femme artist isn't getting a chance to right any narrative wrongs that the writer might have.
Yeah, it all comes from the perspective, and you can only fix so much through body language and design and composition when the perspective itself from which the actions come from and the writing comes, it's flawed, or not necessarily flawed, but diminished and obfuscated in some way.
Yeah.
I don't know, closing remarks on Americatown for me. I don't think it was that bad. It was strange. It was a very, very strange comic and a bit misguided. It felt very much like a Planet of the Apes or a show, an episode of Star Trek, the original series. Like it had this commendable idea, and I think the authors did enough research. Like they researched it quite a bit. I think it shows, like, they're, especially because they're not focusing only on the stereotypical Latino migrant experience. You have a Romanian character there that you follow for the story. It appears in a few scenes, and there's a discussion between her and the crooked lawyer, and he thinks she's from Budapest. Which is a stereotype that actually happens. Like the capital of Romania gets confused with the capital of Hungary, Bucharest and Budapest. Like there are hints that they've done the research, but you can only do so much through research, and it's also very very slight. Like
I think when it came to the book, to the overall story, it intended to be something bigger. Even when I was drawing the last issue, I was like, what is this?
It ended so abruptly.
It ended very abruptly. It probably ended like it wanted to be season 1 of something. And these are TV writers. And I'm sorry if they got saddled with me, a sort of a different kind of artist than sort of like the maybe gritty HBO realism they might have wanted. Like, I cannot imagine these two writers imagining my art when they first pitched this book. I might have been like a third or fourth pick, or a third or fourth artist that they pitched to.
Did they complain about the art, or?
I never once heard from them, other than there was this period of time where they didn't get back to me on a script. Like, this was all through editor.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a period of time in which they hadn't finished up the script. That started the lateness that eventually, after issue 4, it was only released completely as a trade. So it was 4 issues, then the book got canceled, quote unquote, and then it got released as the 8-issue trade.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never had any interactions with them. I'm just like assuming this from the fact that they worked on the HBO series Oz.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't seem like anime fans, you know? Like, my work isn't exactly anime, but there's definitely like this cartoony aspect to it. And I could definitely feel a conflict between how I was working and the story that they were trying to tell. And I couldn't simply change my style 100% to suit that world, especially when after a while they were hurrying me, you know?
Mm-hmm. And in terms of collaboration and discussion with the colorists, did you have any interactions, or the same for the editors? Because
no.
When you're doing your own work, you have a very particular style of coloring yourself.
Yes.
And this one is much flatter and less flashy.
I want to be as diplomatic as possible about the coloring on this work, but the coloring on this book had me depressed throughout all of the production of Americatown. The first issue was colored by someone else. I believe his name was Vladimir Popov.
Yeah.
I'm not super sure who colored the rest. I've blanked it out.
Matt Battaglia.
And when I first got the first colored pages, I was so tempted to send back my own colors. Like, I thought that like I could definitely color this in a way that I could do it quickly, but I didn't because I didn't want to be problematic or troublesome in literally my first job. So there was again, biting my tongue because I did not have any creative say in this matter. Like, I can only imagine the editor thinking how silly this little artist man thinking that he can give the colorist note.
On the other hand, I think you have to imagine that the colorists themselves weren't
a similar situation.
Yeah. They also were probably rushed and paid not as much as they deserved, and
yes. And for projects that were bigger, like let's say something like this, like Americatown, or something like IDW, that I later did with Judge Dredd. In general, I was probably going to be paid for black and white art, and I accepted that I was going to be paid for black and white art. Mm-hmm. If it was a smaller project, if it's something that had a little bit more of a timeline to work on, I would suggest coloring my work myself. And even though it's been so much more work, I've been mentally and spiritually at peace with that work.
Mm-hmm. Like you did in Cloudia and Rex, I think, the next one.
Yes. I had connected with Ulises Fariñas as I was wrapping up Americatown. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to pitch like a sci-fi project with me doing art. That wasn't Cloudia and Rex, but it established sort of like a working relationship where we were able to bounce ideas off of each other in a way that was a little bit more creatively fulfilling than what I had gotten from Americatown, for example. Ulises is an artist, and he had a much clearer idea of how images could look or how characters could look, but he was also understanding that if he wasn't going to be drawing it, he could allow that artist to do their own thing a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there was a bit of a period in which all throughout this comics career that we're talking about, I was working as a sort of like an illustrator and a graphic designer for my university. It was sort of like a scientific illustration, marine ecosystems. And so whenever I wasn't drawing comics, I was working mostly there. But then Cloudia and Rex came up, yes.
Which is a comic about the monotheistic Christian God sort of sending his angels to kill all the other gods, which
Yes.
take refuge into our world, into the bodies of Claudia and her sister Rex, which then have to sort of restart the afterworld and in the process fix their relationship with their mother and so on. It's a very, very sweet story, which depends a lot on the designs of the gods. I think like they're very imaginative and strong. How did you work with Ulysses on this one? Like
he had a very specific idea for the main gods, Thanatos and Hypnos, and maybe a couple of others. The main characters, Cloudia, Rex, their mom. Beyond that, he was very like open to my interpretations on those ideas, those visuals. Any god that doesn't have a line of dialogue was basically free for me to design however I wanted. And some of it was I feel like very basic, but it was very fun to sort of like explore different world mythologies and find what worked best as an image set aside, because internationally there are so many different styles of art. It's hard to sort of like make them work. One of the first examples was, oh wow, I'm blanking on the name, but like one of the gods that Claudia does become is like I believe is Chicomeacuatl, a Mexican god, or an Aztec god. I had originally drawn a human-ish version of this illustration that Ulises had sent me, and he was like, "No, draw the classical sideways drawing." And that kind of made it more interesting. It made the god exist a little bit more as the style of that culture. In the background, I had like Aboriginal gods and that kind of thing. Some gods looked more like African masks than like people. Once Ulises gave me that sort of like okay sign, or that go ahead, I got to experiment a little bit more, like base them a little bit more on sculptures or on illustrations. I got to include a Puerto Rican semi. If you ever see like this sort of like triangle, like rock triangle headed god character that had maybe like more indigenous clothing, very skinny, he wasn't in any script, and if he's ever like prominent, he's even like prominent in the cover to the third issue, is because that was me inserting my own cultural myths into it. And by the way, how you describe it as like sort of like the all-consuming power of monotheism is absolutely right. Yes, we have this like important story about family, but this larger narrative about monotheism just completely absorbing all culture is something that we're just surprised that we got to sort of like insert into the narrative very subversively.
I don't think it's that transgressive at this point.
It is very directly critical of the Christian God, and I think many other narratives that deal with gods, I don't know if they're willing to just have it as a sort of like a void that absorbs all things in the same way. From, I guess, my perspective as a Latino or a Puerto Rican, I witnessed the sort of like the evangelical movement just completely consume all culture on the island. I didn't witness it, but you know, it's our history. The fact that we have been first by the Catholic Spaniards, then by the American evangelicals, that there is sort of like no tolerance for absolutely any other concepts. I felt that that was a special thing that the book did. Perhaps it's more acceptable than I thought. It felt like we were doing something really interesting there.
It also depends on how secular and secularized your community is. Like
Yes.
in post-Soviet societies, there are problems with religion. Like Eastern European countries tend to be very religious, but we have different relationships to the church and to religion. And they're not related to colonization and colonialism, and which this story it's also metaphorically about.
Yes, yeah, that is very much the difference, and I understand that in the European context, pan religion or like paganism or polytheism is much more accepted and understood in that sort of like Eurasian continent. That's like the old world as it's known, that massive continent from Africa to the corner of Siberia, like the understanding that multiple gods can exist, it's more normal. Whereas America, it feels like it is in its dying breaths of any kind of other culture being allowed to exist.
I think we're a lot more secularized, and religion has a smaller mark on our lives. Even this what you're talking about, this interactions with polytheism, with paganism, I think even these are experiences that come from post-colonial frameworks that have been developed in South America and in the US and in Africa to some extent. I think Europeans are very much in this post-enlightenment age, which has its problems. But another thing I wanted to ask about the collaboration on this book. I've noticed you used a lot of diagrammatic pages and insets. Was this something you wanted to explore in your storytelling, or was Ulysses asking for them?
I think with page layouts in general, I have a way of doing my page layouts, but whenever it is a collaboration, say with Ulysses from Cloudia and Rex, and then eventually like Judge Dredd, he had a very particular idea of how some pages, some panels would look. If he didn't have a particular idea, I would probably like reset back to how I usually do my panels. But panels over panels, that kind of thing isn't something I love to do with my own work. I think I appreciate when I get pushed to do them, because I think that the end result is always more interesting. It's just not my natural state. Mm-hmm. What I did appreciate was Ulysses sort of taking the chance at letting me color Cloudia and Rex, and that is where I felt that is why I guess I still feel that Cloudia and Rex is my most complete work.
Sadly, it was the hardest to track down. It was pretty hard to get a hold of it.
That's a shame.
I think you can buy it only through Ulysses' shop at the moment.
The person who handles and manages Buño, I guess he's in charge of those things, or like I guess Ulysses is big cartel. You're right, it is a little bit hard to track down. Maybe that'll give it some sort of like inflated value someday.
If you have a box of copies lying around, you'll make a quick buck at some point.
Yeah, I'm sitting on a gold mine.
And then came Judge Dredd, The Blessed Earth, also with Ulysses.
It overlapped with Cloudia and Rex. There is sort of like a creative overlap, which is crazy, because Cloudia and Rex is a much more like sort of uplifting family story. Mm. And Judge Dredd is just brutal violence and death and oppression at all times. But
and very depressing.
Yes. Again, Cloudia and Rex, I feel like was cut short just out of budgetary restrictions, we could only do those 3 issues, so the story had to get wrapped up in those 3 issues. And Judge Dredd, I think, eventually like had to get wrapped up that way as well. So I'm still searching for a project that I get to tell that doesn't get cut short. So Ulises had, I think it was Dan McDade lined up to draw Blessed Earth.
Made sense since he drew the Megacity one, which this is a sequel to.
Yes, yeah. Shout out to Dan McDade, if I can. He's a bastard, and I love him, but he's also a podcast evader, it should be said. So maybe McDade was burnt out. He felt he couldn't do it, so a little bit too late, but because of that, they needed an artist to fill in quickly. Even though I don't consider myself a quick artist, an opportunity like that is hard to say no to. So yes, I said, yeah, I'll do it. Hell yeah. It's like starting off a whole new series with Judge Dredd in a weird place. And even if I'm not 100% a fan or familiar with the lore, I knew enough about Judge Dredd to say, yes, I want to do this. I was still drawing Cloudia and Rex. He's like, okay, as soon as you finish issue 2, we can get started on the first issues. We have Jason Copeland, I think it's pronounced. So I was going to be splitting art duties with him.
Mm-hmm.
He drew issues 3, 4, and 5. And then I drew, after I finished Cloudia and Rex issue 3, which at that point I felt like I was just starting to put more and more detail into the pages. I picked it back up in issues 6, 7, and 8. Colored by Ryan Hill, which for its strengths or its faults, I appreciate Ryan dealing with like my artwork. But again, it was going to be this thing where as someone who colors my work, I was never going to be happy with it.
Were you conscious of following up an artist and sharing art duties with another, like in terms of style? Because I could say that it's inkier and your line is heavier here, maybe to match Dan's very inky pages, but I don't know if this is just an impression of mine.
I tried, sort of. Maybe I tried to do some lines a little bit looser. Like, it's this thing where if I'm not... That's the one thing where I will appreciate a colorist on, is that if I'm not coloring it, I will work a little bit looser. And as someone who kind of like understands the coloring process, or like to make the process easier for myself, I end up completing every single figure is sort of like a clean outline that I can then select later on and fill. I try to make the process like that for myself. But yeah, I did try slightly to match Dan's process, but when it comes to artistic styles, and a style like Dan's is one that I admire, I've never been able to work too far outside of the natural style that I draw.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Jason Copeland, maybe his work synergized a little bit better with Dan's, but I just drew how I drew.
Mm-hmm. This also takes inspiration not only from the Judge Dredd universe, but it also has a lot of hints of Western and Mad Max. Are you a fan of these genres, or?
Interestingly, I've become more of a fan. I feel like Mad Max is sort of like the extreme of cyberpunk. It is in that same sort of criticism of capitalism, but it's just the end point, the disastrous hell world that is left. And I think that we understood that we were taking the Judge Dredd idea and just pushing it for 100 more years to desolate. Can I swear?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, just a fucked up version where the world was going. And so I always dabbled in post-apocalyptic work. It is like one of my main preoccupations. I don't know if you've seen like my art books but they're very much in that sort of assumption that we are going to fuck things up, and it will mostly be irreparable, but things will live and occur in that space. It just won't be as organized as it is during sort of like, for example, Judge Dredd's like mega city time, which is incredibly structured or oppressive.
Yeah, this one was a very bleak story. Like, there are stories where people like to say that there are no heroes and everyone is wrong, but this one, it's it was painfully bleak reading it, because it truly everyone is wrong, and Dredd is truly single-minded on following and imposing the law on the wasteland, but it's such a disassociated concept from human living and decency, and a mechanistic approach, and it was and not even those who oppose it, like in the main Judge Dredd universe, like the Democrats, for all their flaws, there are sort of they are okay people in some point of view. Whereas here, even the villains are villainous themselves. And
I feel like we were getting two fascisms in that book. We were getting the reactionary racism against robots in the book, and it's funny that you say that about Isaac, because I feel like the Judge Dredd system at that point was, I guess, what represented to me the classical neoliberalism of like imposition, the end point of that, like that it's still going to be judges, and you have to pick between the brutal authoritarian judge system or the reactionary right-wing basically like Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
And that's why at the end of the book it does give you a little bit of hope, in the sense that it does away with all of it.
Yeah, for like a panel.
for the last panel, let's say for the last panel, yeah. But I honestly don't I think that there is some optimism in even imagining a world beyond that,
Yeah.
But I do agree that it is bleak.
And speaking of authors with who got cancelled, I think something happened with Ulysses, but I'm not sure why. What?
I almost don't want to comment too much on this, because when it comes to these accusations, or it is a very serious subject, and if the people who basically what happened was that somebody decided to speak out on behalf of someone else who they feel was done wrong in some way, and the reason I'm speaking so vaguely is because I don't know what happened. So, because this didn't even make it to a publication, this didn't make it to a Bleeding Cool or any sort of other news site. It was one specific person taking or making a vendetta against Ulysses, and I decided to kind of stay neutral on it. I do believe in sort of like reserving judgment, and some things were said on Twitter, and does one take Twitter as the official judge and jury on this matter, or does one wait until a victim or somebody speaks up about an event or not? I just don't know.
No, if I'm not going to press on this.
It is something that I do think about, and I wonder if Ulises will ever feel comfortable being on Twitter again or not without this same person coming in with the same accusations, because I do know that for a while, any book he worked on, this person jumped onto, like, on a Twitter thread to attack it. So I don't know. It's weird because I do have, like, he's still someone who I consider a friend. He's still someone who I have some potential projects with. After Judge Dredd, the comic book well dried up.
I noticed that, and I was going to ask about it because it felt kind of like you were sort of blowing up, like you have had bigger and bigger projects, and then
nothing. Yeah, I'm just as baffled about it as you are. Like, this was during the time where this sort of like incident happened, maybe, and Ulises was sort of like my one connection to this world, because if we're talking about sort of like working from afar in the American comic book industry, or the comic book industry in general, if your one connection gets snipped, you're left afloat.
mm,
At that last issue of Judge Dredd, I drew it during the Hurricane Maria.
oh,
So I was drawing digitally the majority of the time I worked on that book, except for like the first 6 or 7 pages of issue 8, in which I knew I was going to be without power for an extended period of time. And I had talked to my editors. They had kind of understood what was about to happen, but they didn't really have any idea that there was going to be a moment in time in which I was going to be cut off from communication for like 9 whole days, where there was radio silence from me. From a modern internet perspective, it's like being dead for 9 days.
Yeah, it kind of is.
You exist in a limbo. People are wondering, like, where has anyone heard from Daniel? Like, there's communication and everything, and the hurricane knocked down all of our communication systems. Like, it took a week before power got restored in certain areas in the center of some towns, and then those centers, there was maybe one restaurant that had Wi-Fi, and everybody was trying to get there to get the Wi-Fi to get any signal of life out, you know? So I communicated with my editors. I told them that I was drawing, and this was just because if I didn't do this, I was going to go insane. I had friends who didn't have any kind of similar work or prospect, who were just sitting in their homes going crazy, without power, without water. They had their water reserves, most of them, but it is a very different situation, and I felt privileged to be able to shut down the part of my brain that was thinking about the situation and only focused on drawing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was coming out of Judge Dredd thinking, all right, I passed the storm, I'm done. What's the next book? What's the next project? And nothing showed up. Nothing appeared. I started like contacting editors to see.
There were even a few anthologies about the hurricane and about Puerto Rico. Nobody contacted you to work on those?
I participated in the Lion Forge one, but I remember getting asked about participating in this thing as the hurricane was about to hit, and I feel a little bit slighted, in the sense that this was like hurricane relief that I was working on. You know, like, how are you going to get the person suffering through the thing to put in labor that you're not going to pay for to raise funds for a project that I have no idea where those funds were exactly going to go? It would have been nice to just get some money off of that, you know?
Yeah.
But after that, it's funny because during the Judge Dredd days, I was like, I'm working myself to death. I can't split my time working between the scientific illustration work, the graphic design job, and Judge Dredd. And I've already been working in comic books for 3-4 years of steady comic book work in which I've been like, if I had any hair, I would have been pulling it out. But I made the logical decision to become a full-time comic book artist, and then no more comic book work showed up. And I don't know who to direct my anger at on this, but I will always sort of like be a little bit resentful of the fact that after that I was sort of like hustling, struggling, getting little jobs here and there, but never actually being stable again.
Yeah, what I found after were 2 shorts, the Errand in Spider King Frostbite. I don't know how it came.
Yeah, that was one story, and I had worked with that writer Josh Van in a pitch from way back in the Tumblr days. It was similar to around the time that I was doing This City, This Fire, The Cycle. Maybe a little bit before. I was trying to do a little bit more of like a digitally painted style. I wasn't ready to do that yet. But I had worked with him on a pitch, and he was having not artist issues. It's just that his artist was also experiencing a bit of a burnout, and he was trying to figure out how to maintain a page length of a book while shortening his artist's story and then filling those other pages with something else. And that's where the Errand came from. Again, another project where I'm allowed to color my work, I consider a success. It was nice, kept me afloat. It's the kind of thing where I keep making references to this terrible scene from the Hobbit trilogy. Did you watch it?
I think only the first one.
Oh, okay. Well, there's this really poorly done CGI moment, big fight between Legolas and some kind of other orc, because obviously they just push what people knew from the original Lord of the Rings onto the Hobbit. And so obviously Legolas, which is completely irrelevant in the original Hobbit book, becomes like a prominent character in the movies, the Hobbit trilogy. So there's a scene where this orc smashes a bridge that Legolas is standing on. And to get to safety, he kind of does this like leaping over all the falling bricks. It's very comical because there's no way to make this look good. It looked cartoony, but it became the overarching visual metaphor for what my creative life has been.
Oh.
Every single one of these bricks has been a freelance job that has fallen on my lap. And again, going back to the Ulises conversation, one of the reasons why I stand by him throughout vague innuendos that get tossed around online is that he was the only one giving me work during this period of time. Maybe it doesn't show up because this is work I was doing a little bit, not underground, but it was for projects that were or were not happening. He had a contact with an app developer who worked on these mobile games, and he needed some designs, he needed some illustrations, and Ulises would come up with the concept of characters, and I would do character art. And some of the most fulfilling, relaxed work was when I was doing like game development art for them. And so if there's a gap in the comics career, I was filling it with game development of like character design, stuff that I've been desperate to show since like 2018, because it's stuff that I'm really proud of, but it's also stuff that I can't necessarily show.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout that time, Ulises was the only one sort of like looking out for me, and I will always appreciate that. That is sort of how I survived. Every time I thought I wasn't going to make it a month, Ulises would show up with a little bit more illustration work, or another friend would show up with, like, I did more scientific illustration. Even though it wasn't exactly at the same job, it was through connections that I got from that original university job. I had developed those connections. They liked my work. And so I drew like for a fish identification app. And so I was doing scientific illustrations of fish, illustrations that I'm very proud of. But it was always funny that whenever one of these jobs fell through or were done, and I thought I was doomed, another one of these like Legolas bridge bricks would fall just in time for me to step over it and continue.
And you still kept pursuing comics. Like what were like you had that short in Star Trek Waypoint, and now
Yes.
You're working on the Western comic
Holy West.
Holy West. Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't you think it would be easier to switch careers at some point?
I did. For example, this game development art that I did, that was one of the moments where I was like, I'm getting paid well to just draw fun characters. Like comic books, as much as I love it, is an arduous 24/7 work process. Like I hadn't had like a vacation in a long time. And even afterwards, like I can't have a vacation if I'm broke, you know? So the smart people in comics get out. or they find a way to get other work. One of the people I really admire is like Ben Sears, if you're aware of him.
Mm-hmm.
He's done some animation work for Netflix, and that pays enough for him to solely focus on his own work. And I have sort of like the writer for Holy West. He's someone who again, out of loyalty to him, out of the fact that he's done right by me, I will continue to work on this project and the pitches, because before Holy West, we worked on another pitch for another project that I really, really loved. If that ever happens, I would love to do it. But that pitch was another project that dropped on my lap at the right time where I needed the money to continue to survive. He offered to work on a pitch for a Western book, for example, and that became Holy West. And those Holy West pages were done by like 2018, and they were finally seeing the light of the day this year. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's work that you do a couple years back that ends up coming back, and I'm now eternally grateful that it got to be a successful Kickstarter campaign, and I get to not worry about my livelihood for a couple of months. It's been great that way. It's been creatively fulfilling. I've been working on some really interesting pages. But the Star Trek gig, I feel like I conjured up through sheer strength of will. Because I drew Judge Dredd. I knew that I had some kind of editorial connection to IDW, and I absolutely love Star Trek. That's not a joke or a bit. I wasn't doing a bit. I still, to this day, when I don't know what to watch, I just watch Star Trek reruns. And in an ideal scenario, I'd be drawing Star Trek comics. If I got hired to draw Star Trek comics how I draw, and not have like likenesses enforced on me, that would be probably one of my ideal creative scenarios.
What I was going to comment on the Star Wars issue is that I really liked how you managed to balance the likeness of the characters with your own style, because there are a few other good stories in that issue, but also a few.
The Malachi Ward story is untouchable, absolutely stunning. It blew my people can like both of ours, but that one is to me supreme. It reigns supreme.
But also, and this happens a lot with these kinds of stories where they are stilted and look very much like photos, and it doesn't look good.
The likeness police.
Yeah, sorry, I cut you off. I wanted to comment on this and to.
It was a dream come true, and then it ended. Like, I would have loved for that to be an opening to more Star Trek books, but again, it's sort of like at the end of Judge Dredd. It's like, all right, I did it. What's next? And then nothing. Mm-hmm. So interestingly enough, I can't say too much about it, but with Ulisa specifically, we've been sort of developing sort of like our own Trek, because he's really, really passionate about Star Trek. And again, while during this sort of like 2020 chaos where some of the job opportunities fell through, he came in with another potential project. So I may get my Star Trek book yet, but the compromise is that it won't be called Star Trek.
Star Trek with the numbers filed off.
In a really interesting way. I think we're doing something really interesting with it, and I'm not going to get too far into it, but the concepts are flipped in a way where I'm not worried about any kind of like plagiarism, especially like Star Trek Space Society is a genre at this point, you know? Like after the Orville, nobody can get accused of plagiarism.
Yeah, and I think that's where the most interesting stuff comes up, like when George Lucas made Star Wars because he couldn't do Flash Gordon, stuff like that.
Habitat by Simon Roy?
Yeah, of course.
If you read that book, you realize that the world he's building from is basically Star Trek. Where all of that occurs is in like, it's such a fantastic book. I'm just thinking about it now. But the idea of one of these ships in a much further along future civilization becoming derelict and feral or like savage again, fantastic. So yeah, it is definitely a fertile ground for narrative. And I'm really looking forward to getting that off the ground if it happens. That's probably what I'm going to be working on after I finish Holy West.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed, because I really wish there were more comics by you out there in the world.
Thank you. My ideal creative scenario is I get to write and draw my own comic book, my own sci-fi. But I'll take working on somebody else's story and getting paid over the sort of like creative hustle I've had to do to survive over the past couple of years. Like I'm at the point where I miss the exhaustion of working on Judge Dredd, because even though I was exhausted, I was financially stable.
The work kept coming.
And like after you get the first issue done, after you get that first check, it is enough for you to survive comfortably until you get the next check. Like the first book is always the hardest because of that, because they have like these terrible, they can't just pay you when you're done. They're like, okay, now that you're done, we have 30 days to pay you. So you do the first book, you send in your voucher, and then you draw the second book exhausted. Like you draw the second book like you're running a marathon without any water. And then at the end of the second book, you get paid. And all of a sudden, you can buy a couple things. You can make sure that your rent is paid. You can upgrade a couple of things. And ideally, it creates this cascading effect. I already know that I'm getting paid for my second book once I finish the third book, and it's fine. But once it's this rocky process where sometimes you're hired, sometimes you don't, it's like you're infinitely in the marathon. I'm still sort of like searching for that ideal situation. I wish that I could count more comic book successes under the belt in that sense. But I'm thriving, I'm surviving, I'm doing the podcast, and I feel like I'm getting more recognition as a podcaster than I am as a comic book artist, which is ridiculous, but it sort of goes to show where attention is right now, where the attention is.
That Spawn episode with Matt Bors that really shoot you off.
I guess so. It is funny. Like, by the way, if you ever get a chance to check out the art book, or the art books, the few instances of like personally written comics that are sort of like closer to my creative idea of what I would want to tell, it's in those books.
Where would one find them?
I'm selling like digital copies right now. Like I'm selling PDFs because shipping, printing, I do like very small print runs, and maybe those small print runs end up becoming very valuable later on. Who knows? I'm not doing it with that purpose. It's more just budgetary constraints. But you could probably find them in my, like, I have a store, NV store, where I just sell. I'm not necessarily just plugging the art book. It's more like if you're interested in seeing a little bit more of those, but I definitely explore more of like my personal vision in the otherworldly art books.
I think we've talked for a lot.
This is the Flintayo tradition, and maybe it's my fault. Like I think like me and Ramon, we talk a lot. I apologize.
So yeah, please check out Daniel's art books and his comics. Do you get any royalties from any of the comics?
No. I don't know if any of them have sold enough to warrant royalties. These numbers, companies, I feel like, keep them very purposefully hidden. It's sort of like Spotify doesn't tell you how much your podcasts are listened to. It gives them a sort of a leverage in these situations that I'm not appreciative of.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you work at some place that you're dissuaded from discussing the salary with the colleagues.
Yeah. Yes.
Similar practice for a different work arrangement. Yeah, so check out your comics because they are good comics and they should be read more widely.
Thank you for inviting me to your podcast. I really appreciate the chance to like come in and talk a little bit about my experiences. It's like you said with the Flintayo episode, like Ramon has a lot of like very colorful anecdotes and stories, but this feels like a little bit of a chance to decompress a little bit of my career in a way that I'm not used to. I'm very used to sort of like, we joke around in the podcast that I have no ego or that I'm take him or leave him, but it's because I feel a little uncomfortable talking about myself at great length. I don't know if you understand or can relate.
Yeah, that's something very hard to do for me at least, and which is why I tend to talk about stuff.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on, and because it was a very interesting and enlightening discussion, and I hope
I'm glad we could do this.
Yeah, and let's hope you'll have a lot of work in the future, so we can
fingers crossed. Again. I think I'm very positive about the horizon.
That's a good thing. Thank you, and bye.
Thanks.